The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 21, Friedland. We are processing your papers, Frau Linke. Just a few questions. The two officers leaned solicitously toward me over the desk. Now, where would you go if you were released? Why, home, of course, I replied ecstatically. Yes, but where would that be? I gave the street and number of the tiny house I hadn't seen for over 9 years. You owned this home, didn't you? The officer was eyeing me intently. Oh, yes, I replied, smiling even more broadly. It was so good to have a place to go back to. That would be in the eastern sector. He said again, as his fingers tapped the top of the scarred desk. I was thoroughly mystified, willing to believe that all this might have something to do with the answer to a certain prayer. But, of course you couldn't return there, Frau Linke. Other arrangements will have to be made. Still more mystified, I had to concentrate hard to follow his next words. He was speaking of the wages I'd earned. At least that was something I could count on. You have a nice little sum in the bank. I suppose you realize that. Let me see. Oh, yes, here it is. The officer read a figure which to me seemed astronomical. It represented my wage of 300 Deutschmarks per month since I had begun to work. It would make a nice beginning to a new life, as had been pointed out frequently by our commandant when he wanted to get more work out of us. My prison term wasn't up, but this certainly sounded hopeful. My heart beat faster. We are giving you an opportunity to show your solidarity with the People's Republic of North Korea by donating this sum to help in their struggle against the U.S. imperialistic war. Now just sign here. The multitude of words flowed like an unknown tongue in one ear and out another. Painstakingly he said it all again. But, officer, what is this North Korea? I've never even heard of such a place. The United States is fighting an aggressive war against the freedom-loving people of North Korea. It's in East Asia. Everybody is volunteering to help. Volunteering, did you say? Well, in that case, I guess I won't. I really need my money to start a new life, as the commandant has often said. Angrily, the officer swept my papers back into the file. You could have gone home, but you are obviously not ready for the responsibilities of freedom. Out of the room. Dejectedly, I went back to the cell from which I'd been taken a few hours before. 12 of us had been called then and put into solitary. I'd been afraid at first. Always when just a few were singled out, we could expect something bad. This time we'd met again at the headquarters, each in the company of a guard and each taken in singly for questioning. Later, back in my cell, I wondered whether the other women were already out the gate and on their way home, empty-handed, but with a virtuous feeling that came of having contributed to the oppressed peoples of North Korea. When my cell door opened and I was again called out, I had my answer. There were the other 11 women, all looking equally as stubborn as I. Silently we were marched out and across the dark courtyard. I was hungry. I was shivering. I didn't know where I was going, but I had the satisfaction of knowing that we had displayed a brand of solidarity that night after all. In the building on the far side of the courtyard, we were ordered to strip. As we stepped out of our sleazy uniforms and handed them to an attendant, we must have all had the same thoughts. It was the end of a long road, the welcome end for some. No more promises, false hopes, transports. Enough rumors of what had happened during the Hitler years had filtered through for us to know that there were strange and terrible ways to die in the camps. Certain rooms ingeniously arranged. One never knew until one stepped in and the door slammed shut. Now step right into the shower room, someone was saying. Here's a piece of soap for each. Knock when you're finished. The voice was smooth, bland, businesslike. Death had been run like a business then, too. Didn't these women know what was happening? The sealed door, the innocent-looking shower heads, the piece of soapstone that looked so real. Then the strange odor, the first cough, panic. Wildly I looked around the room. 11 naked women were stepping woodenly down into a huge tile depression in the floor, and I stepped down too. Suddenly, as if a celestial cork had been pulled and the heavens opened, a deluge of warm water cascaded down on us. Whatever this new means of death might be, I determined to make the most of it, and splashed and soaked and dabbled in the water like a child. 15 minutes passed. It was unheard of. Never had we showered like this in Buchenwald. Half an hour went by, 45 minutes. We got worried. Knock when you're finished, we'd been told. Since when were prisoners treated like this? We were afraid to stay in the shower and afraid to knock on the door. By the time an hour had gone by, we were 12 soggy and solemn-faced women sitting or standing disconsolately around the still plummeting waterfall. I can't stand it any longer. I'm going to knock. Frida was walking toward the door. We caught our breath, but no one raised a voice to object. We all felt the same. If something bad was going to happen, it might as well happen now. The door opened. "Did you enjoy your shower?" came a cheerful voice. "Oh, yes." The answers exploded with audible relief from a dozen throats, and we grabbed the towels being distributed by the uniformed attendant. Now, if we just get our clothes back. When dresses were passed out, the possibility of freedom veered a little closer to probability. It was an odd assortment, that pile of clothing, from which we each received a garment. Mine was a black wool with white embroidery, a bit tight and absolutely gorgeous to my eyes. We admired each other silently with eyes that still registered an uncertain mixture of hope and disbelief. Accompanied by 6 guards carrying guns, probability suffering a considerable setback when we saw that, we were ordered into a bus. There were other buses lined up as well, and in them we caught sight of men we'd known from this and previous camps. They also looked quite dressed up. We still hadn't been told we were being released. Other times when we had been told, it hadn't happened. I should have known by now not to rely on promises, but I so much wanted to hear the words, "You were on your way to freedom." Louisa and I looked at each other. "Pray," our eyes said. It was still dark when we left Hoheneck, but on the highway the sun broke over the horizon, and I reveled in the lovely sight of sunrise and hills and forest. If this was just a convenient way to lead us to our deaths quietly, I was thankful that in my last moments I could look at such beauties of God's creation. When the bus slowed down and came to a stop in the woods, far from any town or dwelling or railway siding, the beautiful possibility seemed to disintegrate visibly before my eyes in the memory of another forest and the sharp crack of rifle fire. Only then I'd been marching all night under Russian guard, tired and starved. Now, I thought ironically, my German captors could truthfully say that when death finally came to Maria Linke, she had gone well-fed, riding in style, and wearing an embroidered dress. It turned out to be a rest stop, nothing more. We were permitted to walk among the trees, stretch our legs, care for our needs. It seemed such an anticlimax. Determined to make no more conjectures, I simply walked about, touching a bit of tree bark, breathing in the good forest odors, listening to the birds. Suddenly, on impulse, I flung my arms around the trunk of a tree. The feel of soft earth under my feet instead of concrete, and the good roughness of fragrant bark was glorious. When the guard shouted the signal to go and I pulled away, I found a tiny leaf caught in my fingers. It was so soft and had such an intricate design. I couldn't leave it behind. My fingers closed over it, and as furtively as if I were carrying a gift of food from the fence to the Russian guard's beloved Lena, I walked back to the bus. We'd only been a few minutes in the forest, but it had been a feast of sorts for all of us. We tried to figure as we continued on our way in which direction we were going, but all signs had been covered. Every entrance to our throughway was marked with the words "closed for repairs," and we remained the only vehicles within sight. At noon we stopped at a camp. It was for a meal, we were told, and then we'd move on. We were being treated almost like a tour group, I thought. It looked good. The camp was obviously occupied, but we were led into a separate dining room for our hearty meal of potato soup, for once as much as we could eat. The ever-present guard stood behind us, finger on the trigger, again not a good sign. When he said, "It's your last meal. Eat." My spoon stopped in midair. I gulped and began eating once more. I'd take his advice. Who could figure out the confusing events of these last hours anyway? Besides, Louisa was eating heartily, I noticed. That was a good sign. Back on the bus we went, my tight dress even tighter now. A few miles further, our vehicles left the highway for a country road, which wound for some distance through a forest. When we emerged again from the trees, the bus lumbered to a halt. Across the road was a barricaded gate. "Out! Everybody out! Quickly!" No threats or blows, just an uncomfortable urgency in the guard's voice. We scrambled to our feet and stepped down. On the other side of the barrier I could detect confused sounds. "Da kommen Sie." It was all I could distinguish among the many voices I could now hear behind the barrier. We were obviously expected. "Where are we going?" Someone had had the courage to say it out loud. "Transfer to another prison," snapped one of the guards nervously. By now, though, we'd seen the uniforms on the other side. They were the familiar German whites with helmet and gloves to match, and we knew that this must be a crossing point into West Germany. On an instant, one of the women had started to run for the gate. "Wait! Wait!" a guard yelled. "You have to have your paper first. Stop, or I'll shoot." "Keep your paper," she called back over her shoulder. In another moment, she ducked under the barrier. The rest of us were frightened by the incident. Perhaps we'd be ordered back onto the buses, or maybe we'd be treated as hostages. Quietly, we lined up, and sure enough, each of us received our slip of paper. It wasn't much. There wasn't a name or date or place on it, but it did say something to the effect that the bearer had permission to cross over into West Germany. Holding that paper in my hand, I walked the remaining yards to the now open gate and stepped into freedom. If I'd ever dreamed of feeling wildly elated should this moment ever arrive, I don't remember. Certainly just plain bewilderment would be a better word for how it really was. To be welcomed by the police and a military band and the Red Cross seemed excessive. Were we really that important, I wondered? All my thinking was still in the perspective of 9 forgotten years in prison, but here I was being hugged, thumped on the back, asked questions impossible to answer, and hugged again, while in the background the band blared out, "Nun dankend alle Gott." Ambulances were there for those who needed them. The rest of us, men and women, got on buses for the ride to Friedland. It was slow progress we made, as again and again we were stopped by the crowds of people on either side of the road who rushed forward to hand bouquets of flowers through the open windows or to call out the names of missing loved ones. "Look, Maria, that boy over there. That's how my Jürgen must look by now." I followed Hilda's excited gaze to where a handsome boy of about 11 was waving with all his might from the roadside. The emotional stress was too much, and a Red Cross attendant gave her a sedative. Even inside the bus, this short ride had been made festive for us by the presence of fresh-faced young high schoolers who laughed and joked with us and passed to each a bag containing an orange and a banana. I looked, touched, and smelled only. It was too soon to destroy such beauty. When we passed through the gate at Friedland, the bell began to ring. Then the greetings all over again, this time official, as representatives of the state met us and explained that in 3 days' time we would be home. Camp Friedland had been built for those coming home from prison and the camps, both military and civilian. In 1954 it wasn't even quite finished, and the task of coping with a continuing stream of homecomers couldn't have been easy. It was all done with that same forethought and efficiency that had sometimes made the prison years so odious, but now overwhelming kindness turned efficiency into an act of love. Our first meal, eaten at long tables set with china plates and cups, was soup, but it bore no resemblance to anything I'd had by this name in the past 9 years. This was a thick fruit soup of most delicious flavor and aroma, and especially prepared for weak stomachs. As I ate, I fingered each piece of china tenderly. It was the thick, heavy-duty restaurant variety, but to me it looked indescribably elegant. A wonderful packet had been found at each place, too, containing toothbrush and paste and washcloth and other small luxuries. One of the women hadn't waited to read the labels. "Look," she'd squealed, "skin cream," and she'd squirted the sticky toothpaste all over her hard, rough hands. It was late in the evening when we rose from the tables and were led to the camp post office. It stayed open all that night as assistants helped us send telegrams and phone messages to families. When it came my turn to fill in the form, I looked at it stupidly. I'd forgotten my parents' name. The moment passed. I laughed foolishly and addressed it to Mr. and Mrs. Max Zeitner. I couldn't bear to leave out my beloved father's name, though I'd had no news of him during all these years. The message I sent was simple. It read, "I am free." When we staggered at last to the sleeping barracks, utterly and happily exhausted, another surprise awaited us. There, prepared just for us, were real beds, with mattresses and pillows and real linens. It was too much. As if we hadn't had our fill of crying before, we added a little more now for good measure. All through the night, the soft music piped into the barracks was interrupted by answers as they were received in response to our phone calls and telegrams. Some relatives arrived that night. No answer came from my parents, however, and that happy first night was spent in sleepless attention as I prayed and listened and prayed again. The next day we were registered and had physical checkups. Much of that same day was spent with officials who questioned us and processed all the information we could give concerning Germans still missing. For hours I sat looking through files and at pictures. It was hard work trying to recognize in the flattering photograph of a young and blooming face some resemblance to a dying patient I might have nursed at Buchenwald, or someone with whom I'd shared my bit of straw in the barns at Wiesel. But I worked hard to relieve my memory of the 80 names and addresses I'd stored there. The system to determine life or death was as good as could be devised under the circumstances. For each name, I signed a paper stating that I had seen him or her at a certain place at an approximate date. If I had actually seen the person in question dead, this was recorded. If I'd only heard of the death through someone else, it wasn't considered official. Only when an eyewitness death report was received through 3 different persons from 3 different transports was a death notice sent to the family. When I had finished the exhausting ordeal, I wondered if I could have retained the mass of information one more day. I felt completely drained. There were tearful farewells all the next day. With a mixture of sorrow and gladness, I said goodbye to Hilda when she got word from her mother how happy she'd be to see her Jürgen. Here, to my surprise, I'd found Margareta, and she too went home at last, 4 years late. She'd been the first of our group to be tried at Waldeheim, the first one to be acquitted and set free, we'd thought then. She'd also been sentenced to death, but instead had spent the intervening years under strict regime, as befitted so important a prisoner. Still, I'd received no news from my family. The Red Cross in Stuttgart will help you find them, I was told reassuringly. I must wait for news until then. To prepare properly for our homegoing, we were each given 50 Deutschmarks to spend at a clothing commissary on the grounds. I was on my way there with Katie when suddenly she froze. Then, shrieking, "Karl!" she flew into the arms of her husband. When the happy pair released each other at last, Katie turned to the tall boy beside his father. "Christian," she said almost shyly, "is it really you? You've grown." She could say no more, and reached for her son, a look of infinite love and tenderness on her face. But something was wrong. The boy was pulling back, disbelief and revulsion plainly written on his 13-year-old face. "You're not my mother. You're an old woman. I've seen her pictures," he said. Katie fainted. I called a nurse, and we took her back to the barracks. As I stood beside her, watching the nurse gently bring her around, I almost wished she needn't wake up. To have suffered so much, and to have dreamed and hoped and prayed for this. When she opened her eyes, they were dull with an inward pain that I, who had never had any children, could only imagine. Take heart, Katie. Don't let the foolish words of a boy ruin everything. He's young. It's a shock for him, too, you know. Come, let's go. They're waiting. I tried to sound cheerful as I attempted to help her to her feet. No, Maria, I'm not going home. All these years I've waited. Let me go to a convent. That's what I want. Great tears welled up in her eyes now, and I doubted it was what she really wanted. She wasn't even a Catholic. Time would have to heal this wound. Gently I talked with her until at last, without joy, she consented to accompany her husband home. Trying to smile, I waved as she left with Carl and young Christian. I knew that for Katie this day had been sadder than any she'd known during the past 9 years. After 3 days, Charlotta and I stood with train tickets in hand, ready to leave Friedland. We were both going to Stuttgart. From there it was another short trip to the small town where she lived. We looked like twins as we said our goodbyes, both in identical trench coats and carrying identical bags. Our trip to the clothing store had yielded our serviceable coats. There had been a big rack of them, all the same style, same color, same size, generous gift of a clothing manufacturer. Not one of our 12 women could resist such a bargain, to say nothing of such elegance, and each of us had emerged grandly attired in one of these quite nondescript garments. It was a rather frightening journey Charlotta and I embarked upon. It was so long since we'd done anything on our own. Could anyone really be trusted, we wondered? Would it be safe to talk with our seat companions? Would we get lost? Looking out the windows at the people hurrying here and there, it was hard to believe that they were going on common, ordinary errands. To buy a bag of apples, or to keep a dental appointment, or even just to take a walk, seemed a momentous occasion, and yet the people I saw out the windows seemed to go about their affairs so casually. I'd never been to Stuttgart before, and didn't even know if I'd find my family there, though I'd sent a second telegram notifying them of my arrival. Charlotta, on the other hand, had her Manfred to meet her. It had been his letters we'd all craned our necks to read, and which Charlotta had so generously shared with us. Affectionate, good-natured Manfred. She'd written for his birthday just 2 months ago that she wanted to give him the gift of freedom. He mustn't deny himself his future happiness by waiting for her. I'd known how much it had cost Charlotta to write those words, but it had comforted her to think she had offered him all she had. When the answer had come just last month, it had brought happy smiles through the tears. When I married you, it was for life. If God wills, we shall see each other again. Now Charlotta was going to her Manfred, bringing him a far better gift than she'd offered him in her pitiful little birthday letter. When our train pulled to a stop in the Stuttgart terminal, it was impossible to overlook Charlotta's husband. He'd recognized her immediately and was waving his hat and jumping up and down. In a few minutes they were in each other's arms. As they embraced, I looked around. My parents were nowhere to be seen, and my hopes fell. Slowly I walked behind the happy pair, lost in sad and confused thoughts. "Maria, come along. Don't lag behind." Dear, thoughtful Charlotta, she'd noticed my disappointment. Grabbing my arm, she said gaily, "If nobody is here for you, then you're coming with us. We've shared so many years together. I won't leave you alone." Then someone was calling me. "Frau Linke, are you Frau Linke?" I nodded. Of course I'd be recognized as a refugee. My bewildered look, my trench coat. "Your family is here. They're waiting for you." A Red Cross nurse was smiling at me, pointing in the direction of the waiting room. I followed. I thought I saw them then, but could those 2 very small and aged people be my parents? And what was the little gray-haired man carrying? A bouquet of roses, almost as big as he. When they caught sight of me, I read the same question in their eyes. Could this be their Maria? Then we were running toward each other. In another moment, when I heard my father's booming, praise the Lord, somewhere in the vicinity of my left ear, I knew I was home at last.